Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel and welcome to the part 2 of how to paint a very simple, very basic sunflower. In the first part, I painted a background with multiple sunflowers. If you haven't watched that yet, make sure you do. I will leave the link in the description below. And in this video, I will be painting one big sunflower on a black cardstock. This was my original idea. At one point, I thought it's not going to work, but luckily it did. So let's get quickly through the main supplies and start painting. The list of the supplies you will find in the description below this video or over on my blog. As I said, I'm going to be using a black cardstock for this project. It is 250 GSM cardstock from Paper Mill Direct that I cut down into an A6 panel. The cardstock is not a watercolor cardstock, so I had to be careful with how much water I'm using. You can get a black watercolor cardstock if you want, but for this project, this cardstock worked well. Just as in the first video, I'm using Gouache. It's from Dollar and Rowney. They were very cheap paints and are not the best quality, but I'm a beginner on a budget and I don't need anything expensive. In the first video, using Gouache wasn't as important as it is here. Since I'm using a black cardstock, I needed the colors to be opaque. If you don't have gouache, you can try it with acrylics or coloring pencils, or just use normal watercolors and white watercolor cardstock. I think that would also look nice. Again, I'm going to be creating a card, so I have here a white card base that I pre-cut and pre-scored. I have also a few brushes, jars with water and a paper towel. And I also have a compass to draw the middle of the flower. If I didn't have a compass, I would use a cap or a lid from a jar to draw the circle before attempting to draw it freehand. So let's start painting. First, I drew the circle. I wanted the flower to be on the side of the panel, slightly offset, and I painted the circle using the dark brown. Originally, I thought I will squeeze fresh paint from the tubes into the pans and don't use any water. Did I forget about it? Yes, I did. I only did that with the yellow, and even that I used mixed with water. I let the brown to dry, and then I applied another layer of the brown and let it dry again. With the yellow, even though I used the paint directly from the tube, at first it looked like you won't see anything. But as the paint was drying, it was becoming more opaque, and after adding second layer of the color, it became more vivid. The shape of the petals I kept smaller and more chunkier. I just found it easier to do it this way, but if you want, you can also paint them slightly longer. Some of the petals do have somewhat questionable shape. I just was getting a little bit annoyed that you won't see it at all, especially on the camera, and I will have to scrap the whole project. Plus, I was a little bit struggling with the paint, so I wasn't concentrating on the shape of the petals very well. But once I saw the colors becoming more visible, I was very happy, especially after applying the second coat of the color. Just as with the sunflowers, in the first part, I painted a second layer of the petals that is behind. I used a dark yellow for this. All I wanted to achieve with this color is that you can see the difference between the petals. This paint was quite funny. While all the other paints in the set have a fluid consistency, this paint was very thick, so I had to dilute it with water. I also wanted to use the orange brown like I did in the part 1, but here it just did not work. I'm not sure if it is the paints or the cardstock I was using. It's definitely worth trying this as it adds little details to the petals without too much effort. I could have used coloring pencils, but I did not want to make it too complicated, and it's not a must, especially if you want to keep this as simple as possible. Since I'm a card maker, I'm going to make this into a card. This is completely optional. You do not have to do this. You can do whatever you want with your painted piece. First, I'm going to be adding a sentiment using a stamp. On my first card, I stamped the sentiment using a black ink. But since we are working with a black cardstock, I'm going to step it up a notch and I'm going to be heat embossing using a white embossing powder. I know not everybody has stamps and embossing powder. At the end of the day, this is supposed to be no stamps, no dies series. However, I think stamps are more doable for most people than if I handlettered a pretty sentiment myself, which not everybody can do. But if you don't have any stamps or embossing powders at the moment, what you can do is to fill the whole panel with additional flowers or just paint one big flower in the middle of the panel. Such cards don't really need any sentiments. I'm going to be using this big happy birthday sentiment. This stamp set is from Clearly Besotted, but sadly it's no longer available. I don't really understand why, because I think this stamp set is really good. I'm using a stamping tool to stamp the sentiment, but you can also use an acrylic block. Since I'm going to heat emboss it, the first step is to use an anti-static powder, which helps to remove the static from the cardstock so the embossing powder doesn't stick where it's not supposed to. It's not 100% effective, but it does help. This is actually the powder from the powder tool from the company EK Success, but I did not like the tool, so I put the powder into a jar and I just use a fluffy brush to apply it. I usually manage to apply way too much powder. For the ink, I'm using the Versamark ink, which is a sticky clear ink, perfect for heat embossing. After I stamped, I poured over the embossing powder. I always use a piece of paper to catch the embossing powder, and when I'm done, I funnel it back into the jar. I bought it 5 years ago, I use it quite regularly, and I'm not even halfway through. So if you decide to invest into heat embossing supplies, they will last you a long time. And lastly, to melt the powder, I used my heat gun. I made sure the heat gun is hot, and then I brought it over my sentiment and I melted the powder. And also to clean up the excess anti-static powder, I used a paper towel. I thought that the panel had too many empty spots, so I decided to add a little bit of splatter. I think splatter is perfect for those situations where you have empty spaces and you don't know what else to add. For the splatter, because of the white sentiment, I used the white gouache, and then I decided to use my golden watercolors and add a little bit of golden splatter as well. But if you don't have gold colors, you can use the yellow. This was just a spontaneous idea. And lastly, I adhered the panel on top of a white card base. I also trimmed down the black panel a little bit, so the white card base creates sort of a white frame around the black panel. Of course, it is better to do this before adding the tape on the back of the panel. So here's the final card. I really like how it turned out, and I'm happy that the colors are visible. I hope you will try recreating this as well. Remember, there are no rules. Just go with your own flow and use the supplies you have. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that yet. You can follow me on Instagram, and if there is anything unclear how I made this card, you can always pop over to my blog, where I include a full description of the project as well as many photos of the cards. Also, don't forget to check out the part 1 of this video, where I created a background with multiple sunflowers, or you can view the whole playlist with projects like these. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.